Good morning. I want to talk about the Central Pacific Railroad Company. This railroad company was started in 1862 by four gentlemen and their chief engineer. The Central Pacific Railroad was ran by what they called the Big Four. The Big Four known as Leland Stanford, who was the governor of California at the time, Collins Huntington, who was the vice president, Charles Crocker, who was one of the chief engineers of the railroad company, and also you have Mark Hopkins, who was basically the financial and the money backing. The fifth one is Theodore Judah, who actually did the original route planned by Congress when it was set up by 1862 to build a railroad across the United States. Now, the railroad was first dreamed about in 1862, but would be completed for another 7 years in 1869 at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. But how was this all going to be funded? How was the Transcontinental Railroad going to be built? Well, through government bonds, such as the one you see here. Now, the government bonds were issued out so much money per mile based upon the route taken by each of the construction companies. You had the Union Pacific building west, and you had the Central Pacific, which was building east. The Central Pacific, to me, was one of the most challenged routes that could be dreamed of by any railroad company. The map up right now is the route they would have to take through the Sierra Nevadas. The Sierra Nevadas basically broke California and Nevada on their eastern and western border. Having to climb from an elevation of 1,200 feet up to 7,700 feet was quite the task. And how they did this was quite an engineering marvel. They had to build 7 different tunnels through thick granite rock. And these tunnels, what they would do is burrow from different directions to make sure that the trains can get through. Well, if you've ever been to the Sierra Nevadas in California, it's quite an inhospitable area. Rock, snow, very thick conditions, very harsh conditions. So the sketch you see right now is basically how they would do it. They would drill from the top and build from both directions to get the trains through. Well, that was great when there was no snow, but then they had to contend with harsh snowfalls. So the chief engineers, such as Collins Huntington and Charles Crocker, what they would do is they built these massive snow tunnels. And these snow tunnels would help keep the snow off the tracks during the high snow times. They were in themselves marvels of construction and stuff like that. The snow tunnels were built using regular timber around the local area and would help out with, like I said, the massive snowfalls they experienced every year during the winter time and keep the snow off the tracks. Within these, the trains would run through, snow would melt off, and the trains would continue on without any issues. Again, a marvel modern. There's actually 2 trains that are still from the original era that are still preserved. One is the Governor, which you see here, which was actually dismantled at the bottom of the Sierra Nevadas and dragged up to the very tops of the summit on sleds. And the reason why they did it is because there was no track up the top yet. So they needed something an engine at the top to help bring supplies back and forth. They couldn't do it because the track wasn't completed yet. So they actually broke the train down and put it onto sleds and moved it up to the top of the mountain of the Sierra Nevadas, a place called Donner Pass, where now the little Truckee is at, the city of Truckee. One of the other pictures is taken by Mr. Atkins, who was the official photographer of the Central Pacific Railroad. He was given exclusive access to take pictures of the railroad throughout its entirety of its construction phase. He was the only man, besides the Big Four we were talking about earlier, that was allowed to stop work in its process and take pictures of what was going on. Nobody else had the power besides, not even the chief engineer obviously could, but even his subordinates, things like that, couldn't stop work because of the strict timetable that they had. At its peak, the Central Pacific was making 2 feet a day, 24 inches of construction through the Sierra Nevadas and its granite peaks and stuff like that. And from a picture like this, you can kind of see the rough terrain that these individuals had to work with, and the conditions that they had to consistently endure during their time. Now, the Union Pacific, the building from west, had a large supply of of immigrants and freed African Americans who would help them build the railroad. Okay, they brought them in. Certain times the Irish were very big. The Irish were very big when it came to helping out the construction of the Union Pacific. However, the Central Pacific had a limited supply of Chinese immigrants that came in through the port of San Francisco looking for work. When construction truly began in 1865, one of the chief laborers, James Harvey Stonebridge, hired a large amount of Cantonese Chinese men or Chinamen to help build the Central Pacific's work through the Sierra Nevadas. At its height, it grew to 12,000 laborers up to in 1868. It consisted of the Cantonese, the Chinese consisted of 80% of the actual workforce of the Central Pacific Railroad. That's a staggering amount. 12,000 Chinese men helped build the Central Pacific's Railroad from Sacramento, working east to Promontory Point in Utah over its 7-year span. If you think about 1865 to 1869, so it's 4-year span of actual construction work. These individuals came from all over China, but a large portion they spoke Cantonese. And Mr. Stonebridge came up with an ingenious idea of having he had 3 shifts consistently working, 24 hours a day, 8-hour shifts consistently working. There was no slowdown. There was a time budget that had to be met. There was a timeline that had to be met, and nobody was going to slow it down. So Mr. Stonebridge came up with the genius idea of having top-tier interpreters that were liked amongst the people of the Chinese, and he would put them in charge as basically as bosses of each working shift, and it continuously worked. There is several documentaries out there that I have found and have read that the Chinese were great workers, no issues, adhered to their own customs and courtesies, had their own little areas and stuff like that. That's why you still find some of these little areas called the Chinatown. That's basically where it's born from, where the Chinese stayed while they were working and stuff like that. And they were able to still incorporate their own customs and courtesies. They didn't bother anybody. If there were any disputes, it was between them themselves, and they was taken care of right then and there. The main thing about these Chinese workers that they were some of the best vital source of work that could have been implemented by the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Um, they were able to really bring home and embody that workmanship that was so sought after by these tycoons who were looking to industrialize the United States. Um, they came in droves. Like I said, over 12,000 were able to come to the United States and help build this railroad. And that was 80, like I said, 80% of the workforce of the Central Pacific. And like I said, the conditions they worked in, they were not always used to. They went from an elevation, like I said, of 1,200 feet up to 7,700 feet going to the Sierra Nevadas, like through Donner Pass. Snowfall was up to 8 feet, 9 feet at certain times of the pass. Howling winds. It was a dangerous work environment, and that's just the Mother Nature. That's just the elements. But now you got to think about how do you get through thick granite rock. Well, they were experts in demolition, how to blow holes, how to make these tunnels, and how to incorporate these new technologies into the actual working of the railroad company, and how to make sure that they were able to construct these railroads, construct these snow tunnels and stuff like that. And it was just something that was really a marvel that I don't think a lot of credit goes to. And that's one of the main focuses of my work has been also through the Chinese immigrants and the great contribution they had to uh, to the Central Pacific Railroad. Like I said, there's a lot of documentaries out there, and I just really can't find a whole lot that really contributes a lot of work just to them. Some more artwork, some more pictures taken by Mr. Atkins and his work. It just basically shows the terrain that these individuals had to work in: steep cliffs, large running ravines. As you saw on one of the previous topography maps out there, it couldn't have been straight. The road couldn't have been straight because just the natural terrain of the Sierra Nevadas itself was just so difficult to work in that many twists and turns and switchbacks had to be incorporated in order to actually, make the road successful. Uh, what's so important about the work that these individuals did was that in 1865, when construction actually started for the Central Pacific, the American Civil War had just ended. The nation was divided, and the U.S. Congress and the president thought that maybe we can do something that can really unite the American people. So the Transcontinental Railroad was their ticket. This is the second locomotive that is still actually refurbished. It actually sits in the Sacramento Museum. It is actually called the Sacramento. This was Charles Huntington or Collins Huntington's personal train. He was one of the big four, the vice president, that really sought after the construction of the Central Pacific. He really sought after it and said, this is something I really want to do, something needs to be done. So he was a really head driver. That concludes my little mini documentary on the Central Pacific and its march through the Sierra Nevadas. Just a little side note: if you like stuff like this, there's a show on Netflix called Hell on Wheels that actually kind of depicts both sides of it. Obviously, it's a little movie, but it's something that really you can see about it. It's a very interesting little take on it. I really enjoyed watching it as well. It kind of helped me out as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this.